especially when I have to talk for 3 hours. They're no fun. All right, folks, let's get this party started. So, as I said before, the premise of this, it started out differently as always. It started out differently than I had intended. And it wasn't until I got a copy of the book on Kindle and I read through the book and I just realized that it was worse than I had imagined. The reality behind this film is much darker than I had imagined. I do want to say, I wanted to let it be known, and this is very important, that, I do believe very much, and if you know me and my work, you know this is true, but I do believe in a phenomenon roughly analogous to what is described as demonic possession. Okay. The caveat being is that I don't believe in exorcism so much. I don't want to say that I'm a exorcism skeptic, but let's just say I'm an agnostic. I think that most people who become what we call possessed, or what people refer to as being possessed, want to be possessed. They bring it upon themselves. I don't necessarily believe in this phenomenon that people who are entirely innocent and unknowing, like a girl like Regan in this film, can be possessed. I think it's a much different phenomenon than we see in folk mythology. So that's just a very important thing that I want to establish first, is that I don't necessarily believe in the phenomenon that we see in the film. And William Peter Blatty was drawing on a case. Well, first of all, I don't think that Blatty himself actually believes in the phenomenon as it's described. And we'll go into why I don't believe that. But he might agree with me that there is some phenomenon where the thin line between possession and mental illness is crossed. We'll get into his background. And I really have to say, I was going in one direction when I started working on this project, and it just went in a completely different direction. And I've just been working on this like nonstop for at least a week. So, that's just very important to establish. So without further preamble, let's get started here. Let's just have a brief history of exorcism, okay? Brief history of exorcism. This is an ancient stone tablet of an exorcism, I believe, from the Neo-Babylonian period. Okay, so this is actually a very, very ancient carving depicting an exorcism. In this case, an exorcism of a ghost. One thing that you'll find in the literature is that ghosts seem to possess people more than actual demons do. Okay, so that's another important thing to make note of. Babylon. The Babylonian exorcist would concoct magical preparations thought to contain various powers. Materials used were iron, tamarisks, reeds, flour, and animal hair. Ravens and hawks were thought to possess supernatural powers, while owls were associated with demons or evil spirits. This is very important. Water symbolized the presence of the god Ea, okay, or Enlil. So it was often sprinkled on the victim during Ea or Enki. During incantations to symbolize the cleansing of the victim from the demon's influence. Now, this is interesting to me because I did a lot of work on these series of incantation rituals, and so did Peter Lavenda, because he just basically rewrote these to become the Necromonicon. There's a Maklu, the Sherpu, the Labartu, the Atuku, Limnudi, the Tiu, the Yashaku, Marsu. The Maklu, symbolic burning of images of witches and demons. Labartu, named for demon who harmed mothers and their children. So, I mean, there was a lot of demonology coming from Babylon, and that's really the source of Western demonology, okay? Judaism and Christianity really followed on these examples, as you can see with the holy water. Uh, the sorcerer priest would mention the name of the demon or witch thought to be tormenting the victim. He'd then ask that the demon either stop attacking the victim or depart from the victim altogether. Finally, he had invoked the power of the gods or other divine entities. So this is very ancient, and we see something like exorcism in a number of tribal societies. So it's safe to say that this goes back a very long way. In Jewish mythology, a dybbuk is a malicious possessing spirit believed to be the dislocated soul of a dead person. It supposedly leaves the host body once it has accomplished its goal, sometimes after being exorcised. Josephus reports exorcisms performed by administering poisonous root extracts and others by making sacrifices. The Jewish exorcism ritual is performed by a rabbi who has mastered Kabbalah. So he needs to be at least 40 years old. Also present is a minyan, a group of 10 adult males who gather around the possessed person. The group recites Psalm 91, and the rabbi blows a shofar in a certain way, in effect, to shatter the body so that the possessing force will be shaken loose. After that, the rabbi begins to ask the dybbuk why it is possessing the body of the possessed. The minyan may pray for it and perform a ceremony in order to enable it to feel safe so that it can leave the person's body. And I've talked about a similar ritual in the case of Jack Kirby, okay? All right. Now, if you read the Gospels, they're full of exorcisms, of course. In Christianity, exorcism is the practice of casting out demons. The exorcist is an individual grace with special powers or skills. The exorcist may use prayers, a set formulae, gestures, symbols, sacred images, sacramentals, etc., etc., etc. The exorcist often invokes God, Jesus, or several different angels or archangels, for that matter, to intervene with the exorcism. People considered to be possessed are not regarded as evil in themselves, but subject to unwilling manipulation by a demon. Okay, so this is where I disagree. I believe that most people who come to be what we call possessed bring it upon themselves, usually consciously. I don't believe that innocent people are possessed, okay? Unless there's some extraordinary factor, influence. Therefore, practitioners regard exorcism as more of a cure than a punishment, okay? And then we see here Christ performing an exorcism, okay? And I think those are supposed to be the pigs. Is that, the Legion? Or is that in Matthew? I'd have to look that up. So during the Middle Ages, we had a number of examples of this, and in this case, a mass possession. The Loudun possessions, also known as the Loudun possessed affair, was a notorious witchcraft trial that took place in Loudun, France in 1634. A convent of Ursuline nuns, Ursus the Bear, said that they had been visited and possessed by demons. The shot here is from the Ken Russell film, The Devils. Very, very controversial film in its time, okay? Following an investigation, a local priest named Urbain Grandier was accused of summoning the evil spirits. He was eventually convicted of the crimes of sorcery and burned at the stake. And there he is portrayed by the late great Oliver Reed in an early performance by Vanessa Redgrave as well. Ken Russell, who also directed one of my favorite films of all time, of course, Altered States. All right. Now, this is a medieval depiction of an exorcism, and the mouth, you'll see, is always important in a lot of these depictions. That the spirit, the breath, the evil spirit enters through the mouth and leaves through the mouth. And you see this a lot in the television program Supernatural. I don't know if anybody watches that show. Uh, Marthe Brossier was a celebrity in France in the 1590s, a woman possessed by demons who took her act on tour. Her entourage went from town to town showing off the satanic entity. So this was entertainment. Brossier's eyes would roll back into her head. Her tongue would lash out like a snake's, something that we see in the Exorcist novel. And she would convulse on the ground as a deep demonic voice erupted from within her. Also something we see quite a bit in the Exorcist film. King Henri IV ordered her exorcism. He had priests gather around Brossier, sprinkling her with holy water and reciting scriptures in Latin, while the demon, tormented by the scriptures, screamed in agony. Now, this is very interesting because obviously, Blatty, William Peter Blatty, had studied this case. What Brossier didn't know was that her exorcism was a sham. The holy water was just ordinary water, and the Latin books the priests were reading from were an old poem by Virgil. Okay? Her exorcism was a science experiment, controlled experiment, the first time in history that a demonic possession was systematically tested. Brossier failed. Okay, so again, in the Middle Ages, this is the late Middle Ages here, things are kind of winding down. We're starting, I guess we're starting to get into the Inquisition area, and I think the the priests were a lot more skeptical than they had been maybe in the early Middle Ages. Okay. All right, let me just see here. Okay. Now, the case that Blatty, William Peter Blatty, used as a reference, Mount Rainier boy reported held in devil's grip. Okay. And there was actually a film made about this case, but there's also been a number of investigations into this case following, and it appears, as you would expect, that the case was not what is presented to be. Even the initial reports were quite a bit more skeptical than folklore, I guess you would say, or the media made it out to be. All right, so let's get into this because this is very important. This is a case. When you read the case studies on this, a lot of the details end up in The Exorcist. Now, William Peter Blatty had said that he'd heard this story in the 50s in seminary and always wanted to write a story about it. He was fascinated by this story. And, he eventually took a different path. He went into English literature and so on and became a writer. And he always wanted to do something with this. Unfortunately, people at that point in time didn't know what exorcism meant. There had been stories with possessions and so on, but nothing of this nature, the ritual of exorcism, which is very ancient. Let's read this. In the late 1940s, Catholic priests performed exorcisms on a boy referred to as Roland Doe. He was said to be a victim of demonic possession, and the events were recorded by the attended priest, Raymond J. Bishop. Interesting name for a priest, right? Was there a bishop priest? Right? Supernatural claims from the events were used in William Peter Blatty's 1971 novel, The Exorcist. Roland, however, was born into a German Lutheran family in 1935. He was an only child. His Aunt Harriet, oh my goodness. Just like Batman was a spiritualist who introduced Roland to the Ouija board, okay? After her death, Harriet's death, the family experienced strange noises and objects such as vases flying or levitating when the boy was nearby. Sounds like poltergeist activity, right? The family turned to their pastor, Luther Miles Schulz, for help. Now, here's where it gets a little dodgy. Long interested in parapsychology, Schulz arranged for the boy to spend a night in his home in order to observe him. Yeah, okay. Yeah, observe him. Schulz advised the boy's parents to see a Catholic priest. The boy then allegedly underwent a number of exorcisms. Okay. All right. This is a screen cap from the film Possessed, fictionalized version of this case. Timothy Dalton, fresh off of, well, not fresh off of, some years after, portraying James Bond, and Henry Czerny in this film Possessed. HBO made-for-television movie, by the way. In 1949, newspaper articles printed anonymous reports of an alleged possession and exorcism. The source for these reports is thought to be, of course, Luther Miles Schulze. He likes to have young boys, sleep over his house. According to one account, a total of 48 people witnessed this exorcism, 9 of them Jesuits. Jesuit priest Father Walter Halloran was one of the last surviving eyewitnesses. A diary was kept by the attending priest, the aforementioned Father Bishop. Halloran expressed his skepticism about potential paranormal events before his death. So the deathbed confession, folks. When asked in an interview to make a statement verifying that the boy had actually been demonically possessed, Halloran responded saying, "No, I cannot go on record." Okay, so the last surviving eyewitness was quite skeptical of this case, and as we'll see, with good reason. And here's a scene from the film again. This young boy thrashing around, and very similar to obviously very, very similar to what we see in The Exorcist, okay? Since Blatty was drawing on the press accounts of this case, right? In his 1993 book, Possessed, The True Story of an Exorcism, Thomas B. Allen offered the consensus of today's experts that there was nothing supernatural about the boy. Mark Opasnik proposed that Roland Doe was simply a spoiled, disturbed bully who threw tantrums to get attention or to get out of going to school. Halloran never heard the boy's voice change and claimed the boy merely mimicked Latin words he heard the priest use. So when it was claimed that he was speaking Latin, he was merely reciting back their recitations. There's no evidence Father Hughes visited the boy's home, had him admitted to Georgetown Hospital, attempted an exorcism, or was injured during an exorcism. Okay, so the actual press accounts and the lore on this are completely contradicted by the actual recorded accounts. There is ample evidence refuting claims that Father Hughes suffered an emotional breakdown and disappeared from the Cottage City community. Okay, so I mean, this is to be expected. Again, I am very, very skeptical about exorcism. I'm not skeptical about possession whatsoever. But I believe, and this might be a bit of a buzzkill, but I do believe that once you're possessed, that's it. And again, I honestly believe that most people bring it upon themselves. And, I need to keep harping on this because it's very important in the context of this conversation we're going to have. Opasnik wrote that neighbors and childhood friends of the boy concluded that the boy had been a very clever trickster who had pulled pranks to frighten his mother and to fool children in the neighborhood. There he is with a creepy doll. This is again from that film. Interestingly enough, the real-life kid who was the subject of this so-called exorcism went to work for NASA. Where do very clever tricksters go to work? They all go to NASA. Well, not all of them, but there you go. Perfect place for him to be going. Now, I would offer, again, there wasn't really a tremendous amount of films or TV shows and so on and so forth about exorcism prior to The Exorcist itself. But one example that I believe was an influence on both Blatty and Friedkin was this episode, of course, of The Outer Limits, Corpus Earthling, which aired 4 days before John F. Kennedy's assassination. Okay, Robert Culp, Salome Jens star. And we see here Salome Jens in her bed. She's possessed by, in this case, these alien demons. And you can see the same thing where her appearance is becoming increasingly grotesque, and so on and so forth. If you just watch this episode, it's a great episode, but when you see this stuff, you'll just get that same vibe. And I do think that there was an influence, certainly on Friedkin. And we see this other possessed individual enter the home. And when you see these scenes with this individual, it's very much reminiscent. I mean, just look at that. Look at that. The same lighting and so on, same gaunt, white-haired person in black. Definitely feel like this was an influence on Friedkin, if not on Friedkin and Blatty. And here's Salome Jens possessed, thrashing around. We see the candles and so on and so forth. Just watch this episode. You'll see what I mean. Most of this action takes place in the third act of the episode. So if you're watching and thinking, I don't really get it, just wait till the third act. But again, I think this was an influence. All right, 10 o'clock. Let's talk about The Messenger. Okay. Oh, we made through that good time. We made through the introduction to the preamble, as it were, in good time. William Peter Blatty, The Messenger. Okay, The Messenger. William Peter Blatty grew up in poverty, but attended Brooklyn Preparatory, a Jesuit school, on a scholarship and graduated as class valedictorian in 1946. Extraordinarily intelligent man. He attended Georgetown, another Jesuit school, on a scholarship where he earned his bachelor's degree in English in 1950. Blatty had said, "Those years were probably the best years of my life. Up until then, I'd never had a home." His family were very poor. They moved around a lot, but he was so bright that he got a full ride. Lebanese-American family, by the way. He earned his master's in English literature from George Washington University in 1954. I haven't been able to find evidence, before airtime, but I strongly believe that he also had a minor in psychiatry or psychology. Okay, and we'll get into that in just a sec. Following graduation, he interviewed with the FBI and the CIA, but didn't get far because the sheer number of address changes before college rendered a background check impossible. His family were very poor, and they were always dodging eviction. He enlisted in the Air Force. He spent 4 years in uniform, landing in the Psychological Warfare Division, where his bilingual skills made him valuable. This is why I believe that he also had a psychological education. And when you read the Exorcist book, it goes into so much more detail about all the psychological diagnoses and so on and so forth. Clearly, very well researched, if nothing else. By the mid-50s, Blatty was stationed in Beirut as an editor for the U.S. Information Agency. Yeah, so a spook, playing spooky games here, okay? I believe he was also always a cultural Catholic. I'm not quite sure that he was a believer. And as we see here, and as we'll see throughout the story here, he did dabble in occultism quite a bit. This novel here, John Goldfarb, Please Come Home, published in 1963, a farce made into a movie with Shirley MacLaine, Peter Ustinov, and Richard Crenna. Richard Crenna, of all people, my goodness. And was a parody of the U2 situation. What was that guy's name? Gary somebody. Who had crashed over Soviet airspace in his U-2 spy plane, high-altitude spy plane, which lent its name to the Sellout Rock group. There we go. So this was, I believe, his first novel, and he got a deal on it, which is very admirable. May have used his connections, okay? And there are two individuals that will be going into much greater detail in listed on the back cover. I will not give that away. Blatty spent his 30s in California writing 3 comic novels, one of which became the film John Goldfarb, Please Come Home, that led him to working with Blake Edwards of Pink Panther fame, who directed 4 of his screenplays from 1964 to 1970. One of the films that Blatty wrote was A Shot in the Dark, Pink Panther classic. If you haven't seen it, you owe it to yourself to see it. Fantastic film. Then the work dried up. This is very important. So he was going great guns for about 6 years, and very much part of the 60s, part of that whole comic farce situation that we saw, all those films, What's New Pussycat and so on and so forth. Then the work dried up. I had nothing to do but go down to the Van Nuys unemployment office and collect my check, Blatty says. I saw my movie agent 3 lines down from mine, so he was in line at the unemployment office with his agent. I had nothing to do, so why don't I do The Exorcist, he asked himself. He retreated to a cabin near Lake Tahoe during the summer of 1969, and we all discussed that summer quite a bit, the summer of Manson and so forth. Altamont, a lot of crazy stuff going on that summer. Woodstock, definitely picking up on the zeitgeist. For 9 months, starting around 11 each night, the unemployed screenwriter wrote in seclusion about the demonic possession of a girl and the troubled priest who is assigned to her case. The troubled priest, who's a very, very obvious self-insert for a number of different reasons. Blatty never thought the novel would frighten everyone, or that it would become and remain the top grossing R-rated movie in history, adjusted for inflation. Okay, so this is from an article in the Washington Post. So, yes, found himself out of work, found himself on the wrong side of the Hollywood axe, something that nobody wants to be on, something that increasingly everyone finds themselves on these days. So he decides to finally write his dream project. But not only is he going to include this story that he had always wanted to write about, he is going to write about Hollywood. The Exorcist is a movie about Hollywood. It's a Hollywood movie, okay? It takes place in Georgetown, but it is a movie about and a novel about Hollywood, okay? Pure and simple, folks. Pure and simple. This is a guy who had serious education, almost certainly had serious psychological training, went to work as a psychological warfare officer, went to work for the USIA. This guy was in intelligence, probably had a lot of ways of collecting information about people that the rest of us do not. And we will go into why that became so important for the development of this story, all right? Blatty became drawn to writing a possession-themed novel after he watched Roman Polanski's adaptation of Rosemary's Baby in 1968. And if you're new to the group, we did a big live stream on Rosemary's Baby a couple years ago. Blatty believed he could improve on the film's climax by making the spiritual struggle of his protagonist the central theme of the narrative. Therein lies the rub, folks. Blatty pitched his story to an editor at Bantam Books at a cocktail party who gave the writer a $25,000 advance. Believe me, 1968, that was a lot of money, folks. A lot of money. That's upwards of $200,000 today. As Blatty wrote, the story, which he originally envisioned playing out largely as a courtroom drama, instead moved out of that setting and evolved into something darker and more sinister. So what I think is clear to me is that he originally intended to write this story as a courtroom drama about the case in 1949. But he had a whole new set of data points that he wanted to address, okay? He had an experience in Hollywood that he wanted to fold into this story. So it stopped being this courtroom drama and became something much different. All right. Warner Brothers, when they were at 666 Fifth Avenue, bought the rights to the novel for a film treatment. Okay, so this was a very interesting time because the book was published in 71, became a huge bestseller after Blatty appeared as a last-minute guest on the Dick Cavett show. And then, because it wasn't selling well before that, and then Warner Brothers at 666 Fifth Avenue, the building later owned by Jared Kushner, of course, came calling and offered him a deal almost immediately because the film went into production, I believe, in early 73. Blatty wanted young director William Friedkin, who he'd met while working for Blake Edwards. He valued Friedkin's background in documentary film and also the fact that Friedkin had a very low tolerance for bullshit. He did not suffer fools gladly and spoke his mind. And Blatty really valued that, the fact that this guy was not a Hollywood glad handler. Interestingly enough, I mean, these guys sort of became joined at the hip for the rest of their lives. And one reason being that this was by far the high point of their careers. Blatty made a number, they both made a number of films afterwards. Friedkin made a number of films, none of which had the commercial success that The Exorcist had, though a lot of them are very highly regarded. Sorcerer, Cruising, To Live and Die in L.A., a number of films that he made that have, cult followings among cineasts. But the other problem, too, is that he was crazy. And, well, he passed away recently, but he was kind of nuts, let's just say. 1970, Boys in the Band, based on a Broadway play. One of the first major motion pictures, studio pictures that was explicitly about the gay life here in Greenwich Village. So if you've seen the film, it's shot like a play. There's nothing really cinematic about it. It's all in this rooftop set here. But while he was being signed for Exorcist, he was making this classic film, French Connection. There's Roy Scheider on the left. This was a star-making film for him. Gene Hackman on the right. Just an absolutely fantastic picture. Still holds up very much today. And I really do have to wonder, because Friedkin, it's tough with these sort of boy geniuses who peak early. When you make the French Connection in The Exorcist, how do you follow up on that? It's like you start at the top. There's nowhere to go but down. Same thing with like Lucas and Star Wars. Okay. So let's get into the production. Casting proved to be a tedious process, especially when it came to choosing the lead performers. Although many major stars were considered, Blatty and Friedkin ultimately went with lesser-known actors, much to the chagrin of Warner Brothers, the studio. Jack Nicholson was considered for Father Karras. No. Even Paul Newman expressed interest in the role. He wouldn't have worked either. Stacy Keach ended up being Friedkin's initial choice. Stacy Keach was actually signed to do this picture on a pay-or-play deal. And they went with Jason Miller, and Stacy Keach got paid anyway. He probably got paid more than Miller did. However, when the filmmaker screen-tested stage actor and playwright Jason Miller opposite Ellen Burstyn, Friedkin realized that Miller's dark good looks, haunted eyes, quiet intensity, and low compassionate voice were exactly what the part needed. I can't imagine for the life of me anyone else in that role. He owns that role. Owns it. He was born to play it. Absolutely born to play it. And he said so. That's how, his sort of audacity got him the role. For the role of Chris McNeil, many A-list actresses were in contention, including Audrey Hepburn, Anne Bancroft, and Jane Fonda, all who passed. Jane Fonda said, "I'm not going to do this capitalist piece of shit." She was still in her sort of Viet Cong phase. Ellen Burstyn, this is her in The Last Picture Show, Peter Bogdanovich film. I didn't realize that she was as old as she was, particularly in that context. I mean, she was 41 at the time, and she looks quite a bit younger here in that film, which was made not that, maybe like a year or two before The Exorcist. Anyway, Ellen Burstyn received the part after she told Friedkin she was destined to play Chris, discussing her Catholic upbringing that she had later rejected. Studio head Ted Ashley vigorously opposed casting her, but relented after no other alternatives were submitted by Friedkin. Who else could have played this role? Nobody. I mean, this was just set in stone. All the major players in this cast, Miller, Burstyn, Linda Blair, Lee J. Cobb. Who else could have played those roles? Absolutely no one. And this speaks to Friedkin's documentary sensibility. He wanted people to just fall into the story without going, "Oh, I'm watching Audrey Hepburn," or "I'm watching Paul Newman or somebody." Anyhow, interestingly enough, Dana Plato, very young Dana Plato, actually, she didn't decline. Her mother declined the role for her. Friedkin cast Connecticut native Linda Blair, who impressed her with her nonchalant attitude to the obscenities and outrages in the script. She had a very grown-up kind of mentality, I guess you would say, but a very girlish sort of sort of mien, let's just say. So there we go. There are the three stars of this film. Was The Exorcist cursed? Okay, was it cursed? The deaths of at least 4 people have been linked to the film, and some believe this is proof of the Exorcist curse. Jack McGowan, who played Burke Dennings, tragically died during the London flu epidemic in 1973. Vasiliki Maliaros, who played Father Damien Karras' mother, also passed away that same year. Several cast and crew, including Linda Blair and Max von Sydow, lost family members. The son of Jason Miller had a near-fatal motorcycle accident during filming. The set for Regan's family home burnt down in 1972 after a bird flew into a circuit box. The only part of the set that survived was the bedroom. Boy, there you go. You talk about synchronicity, folks. There you go. Ellen Burstyn suffered a spinal injury while being hoisted on a harness, which you can see in the actual film. Okay? You can see in the actual film. And there was even a real-life murderer in the cast. Actor Paul Bateson, who played a nurse who took Regan's blood in the hospital, killed a reporter before The Exorcist was released. This is a whole other story. We won't go into the gory details here, but there you go. The curse. Anytime you make these, or not nowadays, but back in the day when they made these big devil movies, Incubus is another example, you had all these misfortunes fall upon the production. Okay? Now, Lalo Schifrin had created the original soundtrack, and Friedkin hated it. He said it sounded like mariachi music. So they used Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield, which I believe was one of the first releases by Virgin Records. Richard Branson. Horror cult wild parties. NXIVM slave cult had held wild parties and seminars on Sir Richard Branson's private island Necker. Oh my goodness. Sir Richard Branson. Private islands. Boy, stay away from those private islands. Anytime you get an invitation to a private island, don't accept. But we see the twins and the dragon there. I believe that's a Roger Dean illustration there. Roger Dean, famous for his Yes album covers, okay, and posters back in the day. So, yeah, there we go. There's just a lot of interesting sort of connections here. Mike Oldfield and Tubular Bells, which you can't imagine the movie without. You just can't imagine it. There's actually very little score in that film. There's a lot of sound design, but there's very little score, which is why that piece of music stands out. The original trailer for The Exorcist was banned for being too terrifying, which it most definitely is. If you haven't seen the original trailer for The Exorcist, go, after we're done here, just go to YouTube and watch it. It is absolutely terrifying. No question about it. No question about it. Trauma-based mind control experiments. Now, this is something we had gone over during the Uncle Sam's Secret Sorcerers live stream. Okay. When The Exorcist debuted in December 1973, it inspired some of the most shocking reactions in history, gaining a reputation as a salacious horror flick. It was so scary that even renowned critic Chicago Sun-Times film critic Roger Ebert noted, "I am not exactly sure what reasons people will have for seeing this movie. Surely enjoyment won't be one. Are people so numb that they need to see movies of this intensity in order to feel anything at all?" So yeah, this movie was very shocking, but there was also lines, it was very famous. There were lines going around the blocks for people to get in to see this movie. And I think a lot of these stories contributed to that. It's been reported that once inside the theater, a number of moviegoers vomited at the very graphic goings-on the screen. Others fainted or left the theater nauseous and trembling before the film was half over. Several people had heart attacks, a guard told me. One woman even had a miscarriage, the New York Times reported. Okay. So there was a huge, huge controversy about this, and people were having these extreme reactions. I would argue that it was not because what they were seeing on the film, even though what they were seeing on the film on screen was terrifying. Okay, it was absolutely terrifying. But from an article entitled "The Psychoacoustic Effect of Infrasonic, Sonic, and Ultrasonic Frequencies Within Non-Lethal Military Warfare Techniques." Give me just 1 second. The term infrasound defines itself as the inaudible frequency range below the human bandwidth of about 20 hertz. Beyond the use of infrasound detection, this frequency range, of which is inaudible to us, has been researched throughout the decades to investigate its effects on the human body, one of which is its application to military usage. Exposure to levels above 80 decibels between 0.5 hertz and 10 hertz, causing these possible vibrational movements within the inner ear's functions, are said to cause psychological changes such as fear, sorrow, depression, anxiety, nausea, chest pressure, and hallucinations. Okay? Infrasonic frequencies, non-lethal military warfare techniques. I believe, and I've said this before, I've said it many times, that I believe that these certain filmings, certain showings of The Exorcist were used to test out these weapons, non-lethal military infrasonic weapons. I believe that these were being used on people going to see this movie, which would very easily, quite easily, account for the reactions we're seeing on screen. And it's a perfect cover, because all you need to say is, well, people are having these reactions because the movie is so scary. Not because of the infrasonic weapons, because the movie is so scary. Okay? That's what we're talking about here, folks. That I genuinely believe that these weapons were being tested in the early showings of this film. And it was a win-win, because the military got to try out these weapons in a civilian setting, and the extreme reactions were just free advertising for the studio, okay? Now, why do I believe this so strongly? 1973, same time, folks, same time. The United States deployed the Urban Funk Campaign, a psychoacoustic attack during the war with the intention of altering mental states of their enemies. The effect of emotional and psychological change as a result of infrasonic exposure can later be found in the Second Indochina War. Okay? So, at the same time, the same year that we saw these reactions at Exorcist showings, there is this live field test of infrasonic, psychoacoustic, non-lethal weapons in Vietnam. The device utilized both infrasonic and ultrasonic frequencies, which emitted high decibel oscillations from a mounted helicopter onto the Vietnamese ground troops. Okay, so if they can do this from a helicopter, when you have a captive audience inside a box, basically, and just remember that a lot of these old theaters were huge. You could have just put it on the balcony. People wouldn't have no idea what they were looking at. They would just think it's film equipment, projection equipment. So yes, I do believe, and I've said so many times, and I continue to believe that these showings were being used for testing non-lethal sonic weaponry. And interestingly enough, this is from back in the day when, the left were still suspicious of the CIA. We won't go into this, but I just thought this was an interesting graphic. This was from an old left-wing magazine where they believe that The Exorcist was all a CIA script. Just want to put that there. I was going to include this, but it's not really relevant to our discussion. Now, one of the really unfortunate effects of this film was the reintroduction of beliefs in spirit possession, witchcraft, so on, demonic possession, that I think had a very poor effect. Now, bear in mind that these beliefs had never gone out of fashion in most of the rest of the world, particularly in rural areas. But it brought this back into the mainstream. Child abuse linked to a belief in child possession or witchcraft. Okay. Now, I was going to include this again. It's just too much to go into, but there are a number of criteria that show up. Interestingly enough, similar to the symptoms, so-called, of possession itself. But we can see here, these are just a tiny handful. Go online. Hundreds and hundreds of news stories about parents killing their kids because they thought they were possessed by demons. Trios slapped with hefty jail terms for murders of demon-possessed children. Tucson man sentenced to 25 years for killing child he said was possessed by a demon. Subject in death of baby doe said it was her turn to die. The baby doe was killed in her bedroom by her mother's boyfriend. A man convinced the toddler was possessed by demons. Okay, and this is another reason why I have a problem with this type of thing. This is why the church became very, very cautious about, or the Catholic Church, of course, became very cautious about performing exorcisms or declaring that somebody was possessed. Of course, a lot of these, certainly Pentecostal churches, a lot of Protestant churches, evangelical churches, particularly smaller ones and so on and so forth, made exorcism very much a part of the show, okay? But as I've said many times in the past, this can have very, very, very dangerous effects for children. Illinois women allegedly stabbed kids more than 100 times, believing they were possessed. Exorcisms often claim the most innocent are children. Florida man killed after putting boy he thought was possessed by demon into fire. Mother who killed her young sons because they were possessed by demons is cleared of murder. probably on account of insanity. But this is just very, very common and very, very disturbing and very upsetting. That it seems that more people suffer because they're perceived to be possessed than, people who are perceived to be possessed committing violent crimes and so on and so forth. So I do believe that this was a very unfortunate end result or byproduct of the Exorcist film, and probably not one that the filmmakers obviously had intended. Okay. Okay, folks. So we're coming up. Well, the second half of the first half. Okay. We